It's been a while since my last full review. Final Fantasy XVI is the last high-profile game that came out, so I went ahead and did all I had to do to unlock its Platinum trophy. I think I played enough of it to give my thoughts. This isn't going to be a glowing review, but I want to start with the good stuff. First, the synopsis. There will be some spoilers here, but they are for the first few hours of the game. You control Clive Rosfield, oldest son of the Archduke of the nation of Rosaria and brother of Joshua, who is the chosen future successor of the Archduke, and Abera, who is the dominant of Phoenix. Abera is a being who can use magic without the aid of crystals, and a dominant is Abera who can manifest the power of an icon, which is this game's version of the summons of the series. Dominants are usually used as tools or revered for all the power they embody. During an attack by the whole Empire of Sunbreak which kills their father, Joshua loses control of his dominant powers, transforming into Phoenix. Clive runs into a mysterious figure on his way to help his brother, but something the cloaked person whispers to him causes him to transform into Ifrit, with no conscience of his actions, and kills his own brother without realizing it. This causes Clive to believe his brother had been killed by the mysterious figure when he's back to normal in the next morning. With the Empire victorious, his mother revealing to have orchestrated the attack betraying Rosaria, Clive is seized as a branded bearer, making him part of a small force under Sunbreak, alongside one he would be fighting for many years in order to survive until he could find the murderer of his brother and avenge his death. During those years, the land of Alisphia, in which the game takes place, finds its territory shrinking with the advent of what they call the Blight, which is making more and more parts of the world be so devoid of ether they turn into completely uninhabitable deadlands. This leads into the different domains starting armed conflicts against each other. In one such conflict, Clive's squad is sent to kill the dominant of Shiva, who fights for the Iron Kingdom. When the dominant turns out to be Jill Warwick, Clive's childhood friend, he refuses to kill her and is forced to kill his squad leader to protect her. Then this game's Sid shows up and does the "come with me if you wanna live" talk, helping Clive and Jill and taking them to his hideout, creatively named Hideaway, which is a sanctuary for bearers who were rescued from the usual mistreatment they endure in Alisphia. You see, this guy, Sidolphus Telamon, has a dream. He wants to do all he can to shape Alisphia into a world where everyone can die on their own terms, instead of being used as tools or dying on the battlefield. While Clive doesn't completely trust him at first, he joins Sid under the condition he helps him locate the murderer of Joshua. Over time, joining Sid changes Clive's perspective, and you will start to notice he isn't the typical Final Fantasy emo protagonist. Clive matures quite a lot over the course of the story. I've seen a few descriptions of how people see him, but to me he is the Final Fantasy equivalent of Kenshiro from the Fist of the North Star. Well, a more expressive version of Kenshiro. Anyway, when the trails of the mysterious cloaked figure lead to a confrontation against the dominant of Garuda, Clive is awakened to the power of Ifrit again, which makes him believe he was the one who killed Joshua with his own hands. This assembly causes him to break down. He takes a push from Sid to get him back on his feet, not convinced Clive was Joshua's murderer. Jill wakes up and talking to her seems to jog his memory of the cloaked, suspicious person who spoke to him years ago. The two decide to investigate Rosaria, where the incident happened years ago, to find clues, without involving Sid or the Hideaway, although he still catches up to them and gives some pep talk anyway. When Clive and Jill reach the ruins in Rosaria, they find a cloaked figure, who, voluntarily or not, ends up leading them into the ruins of a fallen civilization, and its very depths, some painting of a godly creature, causes Clive to have an intense internal struggle before he finally gets into terms with the truth. He is a dominant of fire. He awakened to Ifrit and he was the one who killed Joshua. There is no running from that fact. Clive and Jill return to the Hideaway. With his new resolve, Clive wants to atone by helping Sid build a Valisphere where people can live on their own terms. It's at this point that Sid lays down his fury about the Blight and his plans to put a stop to its advance in order to seize the conflicts of the realm. The mother crystals from each nation are draining a large amount of ether from the land, so they need to reach the heart of each crystal and destroy them. Finally, the narrative exposes the end goal to the player and it really starts to pick up from here on. I enjoyed the story for what it was, but I think people are really overselling how good and original it is. Because it isn't that original. The warring nations fighting for shrinking territory using weaponized magic users parallels a lot with other games like Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Of course, there are a few plot twists that reveal there is more to the whole story. And the final plot twist is almost one-to-one a copy of another game that, if I name drop here, it will be a massive spoilers for both Final Fantasy XVI and said game. So I'm gonna have to leave you just wondering about it. I don't want to do a spoiler section for a brand new game, so let's just say I have reasons I'm very confident about that make this game's version of said plot twist and antagonist words to be a lot less interesting than the source it knocks off from. The game is for the most part well written, with a lot of grounded dialogue lines, which is incredibly rare in Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts, save for the last 10% of the main story, which was rather disappointing. The characters have the tendency to stop talking like normal people during boss fight cutscenes too. It's a weird change of tone. This game has a lot of that weird tonal shift actually. It seems very serious and with a lot of edge most of the time, but will shift into cheesy action flick tone of dialogue and presentation during icon fights. Ifrit feels like a separate character from Clive entirely sometimes, and in the last 2 or 3 arcs the game stops trying to be like a medieval warfare drama and dives to the usual shonen anime style most Japanese RPGs are known for. To me, it really felt like there were 3 different versions of the game that they came up with, and then they glued them together, but the result was just that the game shifts to a different vision rather than combine them all into one. And the way they handled that final plot twist, it made me feel like the Game of Thrones and Berserk inspired medieval drama was just bait and switch. Yeah, I ended up not being a fan where they went with the story, and that sucks, because it was very promising until you complete the arc of the 4th crystal. But I did like the characters. I found nearly all of them well designed and interesting. Well, the main characters that is. I really didn't care for the villagers and village elders. I thought their dialogue was very boring and would make me zone out from the game often. The dynamic between the main cast, like Clive, Jill, Sid and Gav, can be really entertaining. It's a strong cast of characters and voice actors. It's a shame the story doesn't have a lot of room for them to express the more casual interactions much. A little extra comment I added in the last minute here. This needs to be said. This game, made by a team under a company that prides itself on producing amazing cinematics, doesn't give you a cutscene viewer. Final Fantasy XVI does not have a fucking theater mode. And this is why you record your entire playthrough, unlike this dumb reviewer speaking to you now. Before the release, the producer Naoki Yoshida told in interviews he didn't like the term JRPG because it had a negative connotation. As a fan of JRPGs myself, I think he needs to get over it. It's true a lot of people who dislike the subgenre associate the term with games featuring tropes and game design decisions they don't like, but there are fundamental distinctions between traditional Japanese RPGs and traditional RPGs made in the West. The labels are important. The term CRPG, for example, has been around for a while, and as far as I know, no producer has complained about it. It's good to have terms like that, it helps set expectations. Besides, the term JRPG no longer guarantees a game was made in Japan, just that it features specific narrative directions and design elements. Chain Echoes is by all intents and purposes a JRPG, and it wasn't even made by Japanese. Elden Ring is not a JRPG, in spite of being made by Japanese developers. What does all that mean to Final Fantasy XVI? Nothing, because this game is not an RPG, even though its narrative has quite a few JRPG tropes. I don't care what the official labels or descriptions of the game say. It's a lot more accurate to say Final Fantasy XVI is a cinematic action hack-and-slash game. Take that description to heart when building the game, and the nearly complete absence of RPG mechanics makes a lot more sense. This game is very much designed like an action hack-and-slash from circa 2008 on PS3, but with late PlayStation 4 style graphics. You still level up, which does fuck all unless you gain like 10 whole levels, but neither equipment and ability loadouts or doing quests for NPCs are RPG exclusive features these days. Meanwhile, status ailments and debuffs are gone, character attributes are limited to physical damage, magic damage and defense. The elemental for magic attacks don't affect your damage because elemental weakness don't exist, and you have no control over who is in your party and what they can do, except Torgal, the wolf companion, who you can order to attack, knock enemies up, which never works on enemies where this would actually be useful, or give you some crappy healing. So Yoshi P's master plan to prevent this game from being called a JRPG was to strip it off JRPG mechanics. Truly a genius move. The game's combat in the first few hours, or maybe even your entire first playthrough, will often feel like an oversimplified version of Bayonetta, with emphasis on dodging and countering for extra damage, and taking short windows of opportunity to deal a string of combos or two before they're ready to attack again. I've seen people call DMC light online, but I don't have that much of an experience with Devil May Cry, so oversimplified Bayonetta it is. There is no witch time, but among the accessories the game literally gives you for free from the start, you have one that slows time down to give you a moment longer to dodge incoming attacks. Square is mashed for melee combos, triangle for a ranged magic attack. You can string melee and magic together to do magic bursts, up to 4 in a single combo if you time it right. Combos don't get much deeper than that though, it's really easy to learn. You can also unlock more basic moves like a dash piercing attack to move towards an enemy faster, the ability to parry, which I'll admit can be very satisfying if you pull it off, and an aerial finisher. But in the higher difficulty mode, relying too much on just smashing square and triangle makes battles take an eternity. That's because Final Fantasy XVI's combat system was made for you to rely more on your icon abilities instead. You can equip up to 3 icons and toggle between them in battle. Each icon has a set ability with no hard cooldown, and choose slots for you to set 2 other abilities of your choice, which have relatively long cooldowns. As you get AP from battles and quests, you get to use the AP to unlock more abilities or upgrade them. You know, like any modern action game with skill tree and ability upgrade systems. Some abilities take more than one upgrade before they are mastered, and any ability you mastered can be paired with any icon, instead of being restricted to the icon of the ability tree you'll learn from. This is where most of this game's character loadout customization comes from. Some abilities will be more useful for certain kinds of encounters than others, but overall this game really is not very punishing towards any type of loadout, so at worst you take longer to win a battle rather than feel like you screwed yourself for not equipping so and so ability. And I mean even for Final Fantasy mode, which is just the name the game gave to the hard mode you unlock with New Game Plus. The game clearly expects you to use the abilities as often as possible though. Your bottom mashing combos are for the most part just glorified cheap damage auto attacks, which makes this game's combat more comparable to stuff like Xenoblade or Final Fantasy XIV, pretending it's Devil May Cry. I think the comparison with Xenoblade is even more fair considering the design of the battle HUD sure looks a lot like the ones used in Xenoblade 2 and 3. Shame the comparison ends there since the combat in 16 isn't really that deep. And before you tell me the HUD similarity is only a coincidence, well, they also have this character relationship viewer thing that looks very similar to affinity charts from Xenoblade, even use the exact same heart-to-heart icon. The lack of debuff, elemental wheel stats ailments, the ease of hitting bosses with your abilities, the hyper-focus on the tedious stagger gauge mechanic, and how incredibly repetitive it becomes, unless you intentionally change your icon setup just for sake of making the next few fights feel more different, really hurt the experience in the long term. I still had fun with bosses, but the regular encounters became boring very early. To make the regular encounters even worse, this game is very poorly balanced with its reward versus time. Encounters outside of dungeons, or stages as they're called here, give you a lot of worthless loot you easily end up with the excess of, at a measly amount of gil and experience. The loot in this game is used to craft and upgrade equipment, but it's really easy to have more than you could ever need. The exception to that rule is the loot that's unique to bosses and notorious marks that you'll track with the hunt board you unlock later in the game. There are 2 types of regular enemies, small ones that usually come in groups, and bigger enemies which have their own stagger gauge. The big enemies usually take 10 times longer than the smaller enemies, and yet they thought it was a good idea to have them give way less rewards than the small enemy groups. With how long their encounters last, it's just a complete waste of time to not avoid those enemies. Actually, that applies to all normal avoidable encounters. This game suffers from the modern Paper Mario effect, where if you don't absolutely love the combat, you will find yourself trying to avoid fighting as much as you can, because the optional battles are just not worth the time and miserable rewards. Same also applies to many of the items you pick up from the environment and chests. Almost every chest that doesn't have an accessory is useless. Potions and high potions can be part of the exception if you're bad at not taking damage like I am. It really is basically Final Fantasy XIV with a dodge button. Even the boss AoE mechanics are very similar. It also explains why the RPG mechanics are sorted down and you have so little variables to add to your builds. Yeah, you do have equipment to change and upgrade, but it's also very basic. Weapon and armor upgrades, if done as soon as possible, give you some really tiny damage resistance increments. It takes at least half a dozen worth in upgrades to start noticing a difference. Accessories are mostly worthless since the cooldown reduction and damage increase they provide is extremely conservative. When you only have 3 slots to choose from, there is no sensible reason to pick a -3 seconds cooldown with one specific ability versus getting a temporary boost in attack power after a dodge. The few useful accessories are found way earlier than the accessories for abilities you could have wanted. They tried to remedy this in Final Fantasy mode by making the weapon upgrade increments more substantial and letting you upgrade the accessories to double their effects. But even with doubled effects, most accessories are still not good enough over the universally good ones, and I don't care what kind of niche build you're trying to pull, majority of the ability-specific accessories aren't a significant boost because their abilities are not that great in the first place. While a bigger damage boost is good, enemies in this difficulty mode are all above level 40, so you're still not gonna notice that much of a difference unless you craft gear that uses Notorious Mark material. It's also a very awful design decision to unlock this somewhat more interesting gear scaling behind a difficulty mode that requires you to beat the whole game. Aside from accessories, the gearing is so redundant overall. With a completely vertical progression, multiple upgrade tiers so pointless you might as well skip for a while, no flexibility of attributes to make you have to choose, something that both Devil May Cry and Bayonetta offer by the way. It really feels as if they only had this in place for sake of having it. People who defend bare bones vertical gear progression like to talk about how choice is an illusion in horizontal progression. Yeah, well, 2/3 of the gear progression in Final Fantasy XVI is an illusion of upgrade. Icon fights are similar to the normal combat system, but you don't have the flexibility of changing your abilities. Instead, with each fight, the game gives you more and more abilities and moves, gradually open up what you can do as Ifrit. Unfortunately, there are very few icon fights, all which are mandatory. The first one doesn't give a good impression, with no variety of moves and generally being very easy. I love the other fights. I thought I was going to hate the Ifrit battles, but they ended up becoming the most fun and most memorable set piece of the entire game for me. Playing as Ifrit feels great. It's like controlling a heavy but very agile kaiju, beating the crap of other kaiju, and you can feel the weight and oomph of his attacks. Yeah, there are a lot of QTEs, but for a kaiju duel, I think they fit well. I enjoy these fights so much, I wish they would make a solo Ifrit spin-off in the future, with no Clive or anything. Just Ifrit saying cheesy lines, swearing and beating the giant monsters in New York or something. Or maybe I just want Square Enix to make a Godzilla game. Sadly, in addition to including very few of these in Final Fantasy XVI, they chose to have the final icon fight be the equivalent of a Sega CD FMV game, with nothing but quick-time events in long draw intervals. Talk about going out with a fart. This game is fairly linear, so don't expect to spend a lot of time exploring. The cycle the story of the game leads you through is like this. The hideaway works as a central hub. You're told where to go by Sid or another important NPC, which unlocks a new location in the map or highlights where you should revisit. You go through an area with a lot of optional encounters, you reach a village or some kind of hamlet, meet the local leader NPC, and that NPC can't or will not help you with what you will need until you do some kind of busy work. After that, you're able to reach the next important location for the main story to start moving again. Then you unlock the next dungeon, which again is called staging this. You go through the dungeon, boss fight happens, a lot of cool stuff happens in the story, then it's back to being the hideaway until the next new area or revisit. The quests you do, be them mandatory or not, don't have any interesting objectives. They're fairly basic, involving going somewhere to pick stuff in the ground or go somewhere and finish off a monster or waves of monsters. I thought the quests and the busy work the town leaders ask of you were the lowest point of the game. I didn't find their context engaging the slightest, feeling like padding to stall progression of the main story. Sometimes they provide extra world building, but I don't think everything they add has any value. Some of it is fairly common sense by the time you get to the quest, and some feel like hammering you in the head with lore detail or themes you're already very aware of. The presentation of the dialogue with NPCs during most quests is also way too flat and sterile, which is why I mentioned earlier those NPCs made me zone out from the game. To give you an idea how much the quests bored me, I started skipping their cutscenes entirely later in the game, and I can safely say my enjoyment of the main story was not affected by it. I seriously doubt what I missed would have made me more interested in Valisthea as a setting as well. Because, to be honest, for a setting with a massive amount of unlockable lore codex that you complete with the story, side quests, and just talking to people, Valisthea sure is boring. For all the problems I have with Square Enix, I usually know that I can go into their games expecting a setting that sets itself apart from other games, even if they're thematically similar. The setting of Final Fantasy XIV, for example, which is a good one to compare since it's the other game this team made, is distinct from other Final Fantasy games and other games in general. It has its own identity, and even that game's worst maps have something then that sticks with you. Valisthea doesn't. I know generic is the word people like to use when describing thing they don't like, but this setting really is aesthetically as generic as you can get. It's what you get if you ask any random Joe Schmo to imagine a gritty medieval setting. There is nothing particularly memorable about the world of Final Fantasy XVI other than the fallen civilization ruins and the mother crystals. This further discouraged me from being excited about exploring the maps. There just aren't interesting landmarks to find or look at. Not to mention the areas are either very barren or literally very narrow hallways with nothing going on but a few enemy groups. And while touching the subject of map design, the invisible walls are very annoying. So many of them were just unnecessary, forcing you to take long detours just because the game tells you to, even if they could have easily allowed the player to pass straight through. And sometimes the elevations you can jump over and the ones you can't aren't obvious because the placement of the damn invisible walls is not consistent enough. This is the number one reason I say this game feels like it was designed like a PlayStation 3 game from 2008. The questing system and the level design are extremely basic and dated. I guess it could be argued the game's incentive for exploring comes in form of these secret challenges you find in each region. But the challenges are very easy and very short-lived. With only one challenge for each icon in the game, there isn't a lot of them either. The design of the NPCs just adds to the bland aesthetic of Valisthea. They look like they were modeled by some guy who spent his time making the most realistic depiction of random people he saw in the Renaissance fair. Really, they look like real, normal-ass people wearing low-budget costumes with the color washed out of them. Seeing them talking to the very stylized Final Fantasy models like Clive or Joe is just so jarring it takes me out of the game. It's the same problem I had with NPCs in Final Fantasy VII Remake. They don't look like they belong in the same universe. Valisthea is generic medieval land, but with Final Fantasy characters and giant crystals thrown in. And if I don't think this setting has anything that sets itself apart or that visually complements all the tons of unlockable text walls of lore exposition, I just stop caring about the competition, about the quest padding the main story progression, and about Heracles, Hippocrates, Aristotle, or whatever his weird name was in his 1,000 tomes. I know this is going to piss off some people, but these are my honest feelings. Valisthea can have all the written lore in the universe. It doesn't mean anything to me when, at the end of the day, the world looks like it was generated by an AI with 3 words for text prompt. It lacks identity, and is easily the weakest setting of the entire franchise. One thing I can't call uninspired is the soundtrack. It lacks catchy songs and it's made of cinematic and ambient themes, but it complements the set pieces and situations perfectly. It's definitely very different to what the composer Masayoshi Soken does with his music in Final Fantasy XIV. Admittedly, not the kind of soundtrack I prefer, but you can tell when a composer put blood and sweat into his work, and Soken is always amazing in what he does. There wasn't any moment I felt distracted by the background music in a bad way. The sound direction also deserves compliment. It's something Final Fantasy is consistently good at. The sound effects are perfect, especially in combat, making every strike feel incredibly satisfying. You're probably thinking I hated the game. I didn't. The main story, likable and mature main cast of characters, boss fights and icon battles kept me going. It's just everything else I thought was incredibly boring. Even with how repetitive Clive's combat moves are, I had a lot of fun with the major boss battles. Trying your best to master dodging the boss's unique set of moves, timing the half for complete depletion of the stagger gauge, just right to cancel incoming dangerous attacks and pushing yourself to try a clear without using a single potion was pretty satisfying. And while the general consensus is that the game is very easy, even New Game Plus, with its higher damage and more complex enemy encounters, for someone like me who sucks at Bayonetta, you might still get a few game overs. Though I didn't enjoy the lesser bosses and mini-bosses as much, the game has a serious enemy variety problem. I've fought some of the same bosses 4 or 5 times with very little changes to the attack patterns. The only standouts with substantial changes are S-rank Notorious marks. In terms of post-game content, there is very little. No extra Notorious mark that requires beating the game or unlocking New Game Plus or anything of the sort. All you get is the ability to craft Ultimate Weapon in Final Fantasy mode. The game also lets you replay stages and bosses, but I don't see any point when you can even use this to grind levels or gil, as those rewards get a huge nerf once you beat the stages for the first time. But hey, you can always play Arcade mode, which ranks you based on battle technique. Do I recommend Final Fantasy XIV? Yes. Yes, I do. Do I recommend Final Fantasy XVI? You know, I did platinum this game because quite frankly it's very easy to get the platinum trophy for it. And I did honestly enjoy my time with the story bosses and playing as E3. But in hindsight, I don't think this game is worth its price tag. It's not worth the 70 USD I paid, and it's definitely not worth the hype that surrounds every numbered Final Fantasy game that gets announced. This game doesn't add anything to any of its subgenres, and while not devoid of fun, it doesn't do anything it set out to do as well as the games it was inspired by. They wanted it to be like Devil May Cry, but refused to have the same freeform depth or level of difficulty. They wanted the setting to be like Berserk or Drakengard, but were too scared to make it anywhere near as brutal or dark. I admit I don't know much about Berserk, but I do know Drakengard is heavily influenced by it, and that game had this sense of inevitable doom halting all the way through. 16 is constantly shooing that gloom away every time it creeps in, keeping a strong sense of hopefulness, despite the presence of the Blight. I always say no one should pay for a game exclusively because of its narrative, since a static linear narrative can be experienced just the same watching a video or someone else play. Not every game is like that, but it's definitely the case for Final Fantasy games. I know most of you will end up buying games under that pretense anyway, so I'll just say, do not pay full price for this. Wait for a general sale. As a video game, Final Fantasy XVI is like a desert of uninspired mediocrity with brief memorable moments of awesome. The story itself is not bad, but its twists are taken straight from other comparatively far more ambitious games. The edge of its dreary setting doesn't embrace that edge properly, and is just executed more poorly. Since the year 2001, Square Enix AAA games have felt to me like they have only ever evolved in their ability to make pretty flashy particle effects and exciting on-rail set pieces. They used to be trendsetters for the Japanese RPG subgenre. Now they keep shying away from that subgenre while constantly tripping on their feet trying to play catch up with the Western game trends that have been done better years before they do it. They hyper-focus on style over substance, still designing their levels like we're playing on PlayStation 2. If it didn't have the Final Fantasy brand, no one would care. It would be considered a niche DMC-like hidden gem with neat Berserk influence and a cool story that stumbles on itself towards the end. And that's why the Final Fantasy brand exists. You see, any game can be a numbered Final Fantasy, as long as the Square Enix executives see potential in its marketing, the production quality of the cinematics look impressive, and they tick the usual boxes of having a chocobo and some character called Sid in it. Thank you for watching. Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to play Chain Echoes to detoxify myself.